Good afternoon. My name is Tom Jones, and I'm the Executive Director of the Faith Inclusion Network. The Faith Inclusion Network supports churches and faith communities as they try to include people with special needs and disabilities and their families. And what we do is provide training and connections to resources um, and guidance and consultations that help faith communities offer the gift of belonging to people with disabilities. So, if you would like to learn more about the Faith Inclusion Network or would like some of our assistance in getting something started, please contact us and we'd be more than happy to help out. We're very, very pleased today to have with us Barb Stanley. And Barb is going to talk to us about policies and procedures for disability ministries and disability inclusion programs. Barb concludes one of the series that we've had, a startup series. What do we need to know to effectively plan and implement a disability ministry? And so we've had some past webinars on forming your inclusion committee and how to start. This one deals with policies and procedures, some of the nuts and bolts that we need in place in order to have an effective and vibrant disability ministry. And so Barb is with us and she's going to talk to us about that. She'll be talking with us, and we'll have time at the end for questions. And I know a lot of you will have questions for Barb concerning this topic. But to tell you a little bit more about Barb, Barb Stanley is the founder and president of Wonderful Works Ministry, an online disability ministry resource center that specializes in creating the tools that churches need to support families impacted by disability through free training videos, classroom tools, and adapted kids' Bible stories. She's really helped her church and others to implement disability ministry. Barb has a background in church leadership, ministry mobilization, and also started her church's disability ministry, 139 kids. Barb grew up with a brother who has autism and is a passionate advocate for disability ministry. She lives in Ohio with her husband. We're very, very happy to have you with us, Barb, and so we will turn it over to you today.
All right, well, thank you, Tom, for that, for having me on and for that nice introduction. I am super excited to be here. And yes, today we are going to be talking about how to look at adding adapted policies to your church's policies to make disability inclusion a sustainable and key part of your culture. So a little bit about me is one of my favorite things to talk about is leadership development and policies. So I hope you get just as excited about this as I do, and we're gonna dive right in. So I'm gonna try to share my screen here. Okay, one second. All right, so give me one second. I'm not the best at technology. Okay, so we're talking about disability ministry and adapted church policies and how to make your policies work for your whole flock in the church. Start here with Acts 20:28. Keep watch over yourselves and all the flock. The Holy Spirit has made you overseers, be shepherds of the church of God, which he bought with his own blood. So if you are a ministry leader, I just want you to ask yourself really quick, how important do you think it is that God wants you to be seeing over all of your flock? Do you think that's a little bit important to God or very important? Okay, well, according to here, that is very important. So the next question is, who is in your flock? Now, I'll tell you, I have asked this question to ministry leaders before, and you get a variety of answers. Usually, what I hear is families are in the flock of your church. Some people say neighborhoods are in the flock of your church. Children are in the flock of your church. What I typically don't hear when I ask the question, who is in the flock of your church, is this: people with disabilities, their families, and the people who serve them. But all of these groups of people are also in the flock of the church. When churches get together and they put together their policies and they're not thinking about them, what happens is policy manuals are typically written for people unaffected by disability. And this is kind of what we've seen from the beginning of church to now. If you look through an average policy manual, you'll see that the policies don't usually take into consideration special needs. And so we're going to take a look at what that looks like and how you can take your manual and go through it and start asking yourself some filter questions to help you create adaptive policies or add in new policies. So when we look at that, I like to start with this as an example. So one policy that almost every church on the planet has is your typical elementary restroom policy, right? So if you have a children's ministry and someone has to go to the bathroom, probably somewhere you already have a procedure in place on how that's going to happen. And usually it looks like this. Students may use the restroom with a group while an adult watches outside the door. That's all that you got, okay? We're going to watch just a couple minutes of this video, which is from our resource library about disability inclusion in the restroom, and we're going to see if that policy works for everybody. So today we're going to talk about something that everybody does, but no one likes to talk about: going to the bathroom. When it comes to disability inclusion, it's really helpful to understand what to expect when you take students to the restroom. And the truth is, most of the time, things go just as you would expect, no big deal. But we've learned over the years there are some things that you may want to be aware of so that you can plan accordingly. So we're so glad you're here. Oh, hey, there you are. I wanted to talk to you about something really important with your ministry. Nope. Nope. Going to the bathroom. Oh, yes, disability inclusion and the restroom. Let's talk about it. So today we're going to talk about a subject that we rarely talk about at church: the restroom. Now, if you're in children's ministry, you're already familiar with the subject, but your thoughts may stop at the nursery room diaper supply and elementary splash fights at the sink. And if you lead any other type of ministry, then you probably don't think about the restroom at all, but you should, because creating accessible churches for people with disabilities means thinking about everything from a new perspective. So today we're going to talk about 3 things you should consider when it comes to disability inclusion and the restroom. Number 1, let's talk about policies. Most churches already have a restroom policy in place, but does it work for older students or adults who need assistance in the restroom? For instance, if a student came who needed help physically or one who needed instructional assistance such as verbal prompting, would your team know what to do? Would a caregiver be called, or would a volunteer be expected to step in? The answers to these questions may differ depending on what you, your church, and the family decide. But what matters most is that you have an agreed upon policy set before you need it. So start talking about it now. Number 2, let's talk about what to expect. Most of the time, things go as you expect. But then again, sometimes the unexpected can happen. So it's really important to be aware of a few things that you may encounter, such as some students who have developmental disabilities do not always abide by social norms, and this includes the restroom. This may look like having different feelings towards privacy and modesty, which can take others by surprise. If this is the case, work on a plan that allows the student and others to feel comfortable and have dignity. Another thing to be aware of is that for many students with developmental disabilities, transitioning from one activity to the other is tough, and this can include the bathroom too. Occasionally, you may have a student who doesn't want to stop playing in the sink to come back to class. So be prepared for this by reviewing transition techniques before you go. And a really important thing to know is that some students may try to elope. No, not that kind. Eloping means to run away and is a common concern for some students on the autism spectrum. So if you have a student who is prone to eloping, no, eloping, be sure to take precautions to keep them safe. And before we wrap up this section on expecting the unexpected, expect this too. You may not feel prepared to handle some of these restroom concerns, and that's okay. How you feel matters too. So talk to your ministry leaders and let them know how you feel. If that means that a parent or caregiver is called when a student needs to visit the restroom, that's okay. Because when it comes to creating plans for disability inclusion in the restroom, what matters most is not how you do it, but that you, your ministry leaders, the student, and his family all agree on the same plan. That way, everyone will know what to expect. Okay, so we're looking at that. So our policy that was written, which was a typical policy, students go, excuse me. A few students go in a group to the bathroom with an adult waiting outside of the door. That's what we typically see. But as this video just showed, that may not be what you get when you have a student who has a disability in your class. So would that policy work for a student with level 3 autism? Could you just have them go with another student into the restroom? Okay. What about for a student who needs assistance in the restroom? Would a volunteer know what to do? This is a really big question because what we find when churches don't think about their policy adaptations before they start being inclusive, they don't have a plan. And what happens is what their volunteers do is they guess. They guess. They guess, oh, if you have, so most churches have like a policy that says there will be no diaper changes after age 3 or something like that, but you may have an 8-year-old who needs changed. If you don't have a policy in place first, then your staff and your volunteers have to guess what to do, and that causes a lot of anxiety. And what it also does is it puts you up for liability because what if they guess wrong? Now, I've done this this talk before and asked the question, what do you think people would do? And most people say, well, they just assume that their volunteers will page the parent and the parent can come handle it, no problem. The reason you should never assume you know what people are going to do is because there's always someone who doesn't do that. Very well, you could have a volunteer who thinks that the Christian thing to do is to go change someone in the restroom. And maybe you're even talking to someone who's nonverbal, who can't tell you no, or I don't need your help, or I don't want your help. And so when you don't think of these things ahead of time, you're actually setting yourself up for a big problem because what if someone does something that they think is helpful is actually infringing on someone else's dignity, right? And what happens then when we talked about these people you need to think about as you're creating your policies, one of which being the family, how do you think that mom is going to feel if someone guesses wrong? So thinking about these things ahead of time is incredibly important. And I like to start with this example of the restroom because it really shows when you're looking through your manual, and I would just ask everybody, take a look at their manual after this webinar today, and then ask yourself, do these policies work for students with disabilities? Has anyone even considered what someone who has different social, emotional, communication, and physical abilities, have they even considered them in their policies? As we'll see with the restroom, a lot of times, no. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about some filter questions you're going to ask yourself as you're looking through your policy manual to know how you can start crafting new policies. Okay, so first of all, you're going to take your manual, like we said, and you can start going through each of the policies. And when you do, you're going to ask yourself, how would this affect people with disabilities? Does it work for them? How would their families feel about it? And how would your church teams feel about it? Because also it's important that it not only works for people with disabilities, but also for your volunteers. When we did talk about the restroom in there, you did notice we had at the end there that we are also considering, would a volunteer feel comfortable doing this or not? And again, these are things you should not be assuming. It's crucially important as you craft these policies that you get these three groups of people in your flock, people with disabilities, their families, and your church teams together to give input so that you can fully understand the needs that you are trying to meet. Okay, so when it comes to creating policies, there are three general filter questions you are going to ask yourself every single time you are crafting or adapting a disability inclusive policy. And those are, is it safe? Is it dignified? And is it sustainable? So when you're looking through your manual, you start there. And if any of those aren't, the answer isn't yes, then you know that you have to go back and look at it a little more deeply. When it also comes to policies, it's important to understand that policy manuals are made up of two different types of policies. We have structural policies and safety policies, and both of them are crucial for the life of your church. So a structural policy is developed to help the church function well and promote the mission by meeting current needs, protecting resources, and allowing for growth. And so an example of this would be, again, we're going to go back into children's ministry. A structural policy might be that once children move up from the nursery, they go into the kindergarten class, and they parents drop them off at the door, and the child goes in with a whole class with maybe one teacher or two teachers. Disability inclusion, when you're now putting in people that have different needs, that impacts those pre-existing structures, meaning that the policy you have probably isn't going to work for them. So what we see a lot of times is that churches will try to just adjust the policy on the fly or make an exception, but you don't want to do that. You want to think through it before you need it. So when you're creating a disability structural policy, there are four filter questions you want to ask. Does it solve the problem? Is it sustainable with your current resources? Is it scalable for growth? And does it impact any other ministry? So let's say we're taking the structure where you have a child coming into the children's ministry, and they really, the policy says they're supposed to be part of a group. There's no extra support for them. Either they're in the worship service with their parents, or they're in the group in the children's ministry, and that's it. But now you have a child who has autism who needs extra support. Okay, so when we are looking at that policy, which is a very common one, a lot of churches decide they want to have one-on-one buddies, which is a good way to do it. So if you do that, you have to have a policy to see how do you assign those buddies. So a typical extra support policy looks like this. Every child with a diagnosed disability gets a one-on-one buddy upon request. It seems like that makes sense, but you should always go back and check it with the four questions we just talked about. So let's ask, does assigning every child with a disability a buddy upon request solve the extra support problem? Well, no, because honestly, a lot of children who need extra support don't have a diagnosis yet. So only giving them to children who have a diagnosis may not actually help your classroom. So then the next question is it sustainable with current resources? So if you did do this, giving every child with a diagnosed disability a one-on-one buddy upon request, does that sound like something that a church could keep doing forever? Is it sustainable? And the answer usually to that is no. So unless you're a giant church that has hundreds of qualified volunteers who want to be buddies, you're eventually going to run out of them. And so then you put yourself in a situation where you can't keep bringing people in, and it's just hard on everybody. The next question is it scalable for growth? So, does giving every child who has a diagnosed disability a one-on-one buddy upon request, can you grow that? Well, also, again, the answer is no, because even if you had hundreds of volunteers who wanted to be buddies, eventually you're going to run out of room in your church rooms. You won't have the right ratios, and you're still going to have to stop it. And then the last one is, does it impact any other ministry? Okay, so if you were constantly pulling volunteers from other ministries to become one-on-one buddies all the time, that is going to impact other ministries, and you're going to have problems. So what we see by going through the 4 questions is when we really look deeper, what we have here isn't really a sustainable answer. So the question is, what do you do instead? Okay. So a better extra support policy, once you've decided you need to change it, may look like this. Staff and families work together to agree on the level of support. Now we're going to stop here for a second because this brings up something important. When you write a new policy for inclusion, you also have to make sure you have the foundational supports in place to make that sustainable. So what we've done here is what we want to do is add in a foundation of 3 tiers of support. So now you have some levels of support to choose from, and you can now use your resources better. And I show that to you briefly. So this is the 3 tiers of support model that we like to use for children who need extra support. And what this means basically is at the bottom level, you're going to add in a lot of things to everyone in the class. It gives extra support to everyone. It's called the universal design. The mid support would be targeted support, where you may have a buddy box or a floating buddy, quiet corners. That gives kids who need a little bit more support things they can do within the classroom. And the third one is that actual one-on-one individualized support with buddies in classes and sensory rooms. When you put this in place, you now can have the new policy that does work for extra support, which is where you get to work with the families to choose what level of support a child needs. Therefore, you are saving all your main resources, your one-on-one buddies, for the kids who need it the most. This makes things more sustainable and is just better for everybody. Okay. From there, you can write a more specified buddy policy. This one just basically lays out how that works. Each student enrolled in the buddy program will have a buddy assigned to receive training. Families will be asked to let them know what schedule they'll be coming on, and the buddies will serve as part of the youth and child ministry team. So when you take that extra time to kind of look through the questions, you can actually put together a policy and the foundations for that policy to make it work for the long term. The second kind of the second kind of policies you see in manuals are for safety. And safety policies are designed to protect individuals. Disability safety policies and procedures are often missing from current policy manuals. So if you go through your policy manual, it's really important, again, that you invite in people with disabilities and their families to help you with that, because they will be able to tell you if things are missing. So when you are looking at creating disability safety policies, here are the 3 questions you want to ask. 1, is it safe for everyone? Number 2, is it dignified? And number 3, do you need to ask an expert? So let's look at an elopement policy. Elopement, as we talked about, is for our students who are runners. They may bolt from class. So if you look through a typical church manual for an elopement policy, you're probably not going to find one, because again, if the manual was written just for neurotypical students or people, there's no reason to put it in there. But what happens if you have a student who runs and you don't have a policy or procedure in place? Well, typically when I ask this, people say the volunteers run after them, and that is typically what happens. But that isn't what you want to happen. What you want to happen is have a procedure in place ahead of time so that if this does happen, not only do you have a better chance of getting that child back to class safely and quickly, but you're also making sure that your volunteers and your staff feel supported and feel confident in what they do. Because when we don't tackle these things ahead of time, what you're doing is you're putting your volunteers into a really stressful situation that may feel scary when a child runs out of class and they don't know what to do. And that's a really good way to lose your volunteer teams. So here's an example of a better way to do it. Okay, this is the one that we had developed at our church. And again, it came from working with people who are impacted by this, people with disabilities and their families who do have children who are runners, working with our volunteers. And we also brought in our safety team. So we're looking here, there's a whole procedure. If a child elopes, one ministry partner calmly follows the child and stays with the child till the parents come. The other partner calls the safety team and they go out and guard all the doors. And then we were able, because we thought about it ahead of time, to sit down with our safety team and do a whole special training on this. These are the type of things when you have them ahead of time, it really sustains the ministry and sustains all of your volunteer teams and creates better safety. Another important part of safety policies is to use something called the headline test. Sometimes when we're crafting a policy, we may not know if it's a good idea or not. Maybe on the surface it seems like a good idea, but if you use the headline test, it will help you know. And what the headline test means is you are taking your policy and you're imagining what would the headline be if something was in the newspaper. So I'm going to give you an example of what this looks like. In one of an online forum I was in one time, there was a question again about elopers, about kids who would run. And there was a church that was wanting to move their students from the gym to across the parking lot to an area in the field. So they didn't know how to do that safely. And someone suggested that they get these little bracelets that have kind of link a person with a disability to a volunteer. So the question is that a good policy? And you can ask yourself by saying, if that was in the newspaper, what headline would you see there? You can think about that for a while. You could say, it might say something like, church handcuffs kids with disabilities, things like that. So when you are able to look at it that way, it gives you some clarity on, is this something that is a good policy, or is this something we need to go back and look at again and maybe redo? The third question in safety policies is when to seek an expert. There is nothing more important than safety. And so it's important that you know when you need to get outside help. The first place you want to do is if you have an insurance question, you need to call your insurance agency and ask. Every church has a different policy and different states have different laws. So that's a place you want to get expert help. And secondly, if you have a local law question or other legal question, it's important that you don't make an assumption, but you go and check that out. And a good example of that is with food allergies. So some local laws are different when it comes to having a epinephrine pen or an EpiPen on premises. Some states will allow churches to have one without having a prescription for an individual child. They can just always have it. In some states, you can't. So these are things you want to check with your local laws about. Again, if you need specific medical policies, you need to be reaching out to experts. And if you need crisis training or procedures, it's really, really important that you go to people who are experts at that, especially if they are part of your local state. The third part about creating adapted policies is making sure that you understand what the boundaries are. Because again, if you're creating policies that look good on paper, If they're not sustainable in real life, then what you do is you actually are hurting the people you're trying to serve. So sometimes saying, no, we can't do this is the best thing you can do. The first thing you want to remember when you're creating your policies is that they have to work for both the family and the church, and that's why boundaries are important. So an example for that I'll give you was when I was leading the church, the disability ministry at my church, I was asked, could we have one-on-one buddies on every time we had an event outside of Sunday? Now, we were a smaller church. We had a completely volunteer disability ministry team, and we were providing buddies on Sunday. Now, I would have loved to say, yes, we can provide buddies at every time we have a class or we have anything on Wednesdays or during the week. At that time, we were doing things during the week all the time. But the truth of the matter was, we could not actually provide that without wearing out our volunteer teams so much that everyone quit. So a boundary had to be that we could only provide one-on-one buddies on Sundays, and the rest of the week we would do other things to try our best to support them. Now, that is something in my heart. I would have liked to say, yes, we can always have one-on-one buddies all the time, but it wasn't actually sustainable. And so when you have to tell someone something that's hard to hear, it's really important that your ministry leaders and your whole staff are on the same page before you meet with families. That just helps if your ministry leader give you some confidence that you can have hard conversations and that your staff will have your back, and then you will also all understand the why of the boundary. It's also really important when you're talking to families that you're honest about what you can provide and what you cannot provide. Because sometimes I think that as ministry leaders, we feel like we want to always meet needs and that that is the right thing to do. But if you can't actually meet that need, it is much kinder to let a family know that up front. An example I have for that was when we were coming out of COVID and we were opening our church back, and we had our disability ministry started back up. And what I wanted to say was, if you remember back then, we had the time everyone was supposed to be 6 feet apart, no one was touching the same toys. I wanted to say to our parents, yes, we can provide all of that germ-free safety for you, but the truth was we couldn't. So what we did was we just told the truth. This is what we can provide. We can make sure that in between services, everything is going to be cleaned. All of our volunteers will wear masks. But what we cannot provide is guarantees that the kids are going to keep their masks on or they're going to stay 6 feet apart. And we had those honest conversations to allow families to see if this was something that was going to work for their family or wasn't. And when you do have to say no to something, you always want to know your why so that you can explain why you're making the decision you are and why you feel like that is in everyone's best benefit. You want to really listen respectfully and speak with compassion and understand that sometimes this can be really hard to hear and understand and be compassionate in that space. And you want to train everyone on your team to do the same. And again, when it comes to creating these policies that really are the sustaining factor to inclusive disability ministry, it's so important that you continue growing together by inviting God in and making sure, again, that you are doing all of this planning and this policy work with all of the people that are impacted, people with disabilities, their families, and your church staff. Because shepherding matters, and we're shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, watching over them, not because you must, but because you are willing. Because having sustainable, inclusive ministry is important to God, and it is important to supporting our whole flock. And if you have any other questions or want to see any of the other videos and resources we have, this is our Adapted Discipleship Library. And that I'll put that in the chat later. Okay. And I can stop. All right. Okay. So that was the overview on policies, and I apologize I went through it quickly, but time for questions.
Okay, I'll turn that over to Rebecca. And Rebecca, I think we have a few questions there.
Sure. Well, I know I have a few questions and some others do too. So I'll start with the ones from our participants. There's someone that was asking if you could uh, mention, does this apply to adults as well as kids?
Yeah, so what we do, we're never going to tell a church what policies they have to have or what policy they need to write. The whole point, really, of what we're sharing is how you can use those filter questions to create your own policies. So I use children's ministry as an example because that's what I'm most familiar with, but you can use those same sets of questions to make any inclusive policy for any group.
Okay. And also along those lines, someone else is saying they don't have any written policies at all. So maybe they've just discussed verbally. So can you share either what you were showing just before from
Mhm.
your resources or other resources, examples of policy manuals or something like, is that what you were just showing, or is that something
Some
different?
of it was. So I say you really want to start with, if you're part of a denomination, I would start by reaching out to your denomination leaders and asking for examples of policy manuals. Really, if you don't have any written policies, excuse me, if you don't have any written policies, you really want to start by writing your rough draft of policies, and then you can go in and kind of fine tune it and adapt it for inclusion. But we have some policies that we have written, but again, we don't write them for other churches. You can look at some of the things that we may have as an example, but you have to make that work for your church.
So one suggestion is to go to your denominational branch
Excuse
or
me.
organization.
Yeah, start there. And if you're non-denominational, you can go online and you can look up like church policy manuals, and they're there. Excuse me. So you can look at someone else's and you can start adapting your own from there. And that's your starting point. And then you can take those questions that we are providing today and you can go through those to adapt them or add them for disability. But you got to have a starting point.
Right. It seems like several people are unsure about the actual steps. Maybe we could, talk about different stages if people don't have any experience or also who is doing this like in a church. We talked last week about inclusion committees. Should an
Yeah.
inclusion committee be doing this, or should it be a separate committee, or how does that work?
I think that depends on what stage you're at. So if you're in a church you have no policies whatsoever, you got to start there. You got to start with your lead pastor and your board or whoever that is to just get the basics down. When we're looking at adding in adaptive policies, yeah, I think a great idea would be to get inclusion committee that's made up of the staff and the key volunteers, plus some people who have disabilities and their families. You want to get all those people in the room. But have something to start with. You're definitely going to want to have some kind of policy manual to start with first.
And most churches do have
Mhm.
a general policy
Right.
manual.
Yeah. And so that let me say this too. When you are making these adaptive policies, it really needs to go into the general manual. Part of why you want to do adaptive policies ahead of time is because we're trying to change church culture as well to not be that disability inclusion is an add-on, but is actually key to the whole culture. So it's important that every ministry leader knows what these adaptive policies are.
So it's integrated into it, not
Exactly.
not like an appendix or an addendum or
Right.
something.
Correct. Like you may have, let's say, for instance, you have the policy for the restroom, and your policy is The children go in a group and the adult waits outside the door. And then underneath that, in that section, say, for children who have special needs, here's what we decided we're going to do. But you have it all in that same section.
Okay. This same person is asking, can you give an example of a policy that would impact adults versus kids?
Yes. So one thing you may look at is some churches have adults that come from group homes into their church, and they may have a special class, like an adult Bible study. So a question that some churches have is, what policy do we need for that? Do we need to create a policy where the people who are in charge of the group home stay at the church while the adults are there, or can they leave? Do we need to have a check-in and check-out for those adults? Um, what do you, if you have adults that need the restroom again, what does that look like? And what I'll tell you is it depends on your community, your church, and the people you are serving. And it's not so much that there's a right or wrong answer to those questions, but it's more of making sure that everyone has the same expectations. And that's why we, again, really ask you to go through all of those different types of filter questions so that you can come up with it yourself.
Okay, so even outside groups that come in should have policies as
Well, they won't have the policy. You need to have the policy for them.
right.
So this is something we've just heard from churches that do a lot of adult disability ministry is I've heard this repeatedly about the issue of like a group home coming in with adults that have IDD and then the people in charge of the group home sometimes leave. And then that makes it hard for the people who are doing the Bible study to know, what if I have a problem? Who do I call? What do I do? So these are things you want to think about ahead of time. What works for your church in whatever specific type of ministry you are doing?
I had a question about since there's so many types and a wide range of disabilities, are there any common, you know, points or
Mhm.
adaptations that like essential elements that should always be included, do you think?
Yes, that's a good question. I think you always, always want to have an elopement policy and procedure. I think most churches don't have that. You always want to have that because that's very common with kids with autism and other developmental disabilities, and it's very scary for everyone when you're not prepared. You always want to look at some of your emergency policies that you have, like evacuation in case of a tornado or a fire or something, and say, what would we need to do if we have someone who has a physical disability or someone, how do we account for people so we can evacuate them safely? You look at those. The restroom, I can't say that enough times. That is a big one. And also know that some of these adaptive policies, you will make other adaptations as you go. So there is going to be some room for growth. So I'm going to go back to the restroom because this is one that we've talked about a lot in groups, and people are very divided on how you do it. So when you're coming to like children and adults who may need a diaper change, a lot of churches will say, well, we'll have to call the parent or the guardian. And other churches would say, oh, that's not the right thing to do. We should always go in and change these people because that's the nice thing to do. Well, a lot of that has really to do with who you're serving. So I was in a group one time and this lady was super adamant, like, oh, you always have to change them, always. Like that is the Christian thing to do. And I was really curious because most of the people that we served at our church have like level 2 and 3 autism. And I said, so what group of people are you serving? And it turned out they were serving a lot of people that had like in very severe cerebral palsy. Now, changing someone that has cerebral palsy who can't physically do it from themselves is a lot different than assuming you should change an adult with level 3 autism who's nonverbal but is as strong as a man. Those are two different types of disabilities. So one policy may not be the right thing. You have to know that you will sometimes further adapt your policies to meet the people that God actually brings to your specific church, which is again why we're really all about these are your filter questions you need to be thinking through, and these are the groups of people you need to bring in to help you, and why we don't say this is 100% the policy you have to have.
And also looking toward the future, how often should you keep going back and updating your policies, and how can you predict what people will come in later, or how often should you kind of keep up with this in the short term and in the long term?
That's a great question, and I would say that really goes back to how often do you do it in the whole church, the whole general policy? Does your church generally go through their policies once a year or once every other year? So you definitely, again, the goal to this is not to make everything separate, but to get it as an integral part of your church culture. So when your church is going through their policies, you need to have someone, a representative from your committee, your inclusion committee, being in that. Within that, when you get new people that have things you haven't thought about before, then you're going to say, hey, we need to create a policy now.
So somewhat regularly or on a periodic basis, you should.
I think you should always do that in general, like with all our policies, because things change just in general.
Right. And on, I guess, in a more practical sense, do financial, factors consider into these policies at all? You didn't mention so much, but obviously some congregations are smaller and some are large and have big budgets. Is that an issue that people should
Um,
incorporate?
This is just my opinion, but you can make disability inclusion as complicated or as simple as you want. And so you can make it as expensive or as free as you want. So the church I come from, we ran our disability inclusion through volunteers, and we had basically no budget when we started. There was really no reason we needed to get a big budget because most of these things are not about having fancy equipment or hiring people. It's about just literally looking at what you have through the lens of disability and then making adaptations and then communicating that. So, good disability ministry is more about communication than it is about dollars.
That's what we always keep hearing in all of our programs. It's
Mhm.
most of the adaptations and accommodations don't cost that much.
Yeah, they don't cost anything. So, for instance, I go back to the restroom again because it's my favorite subject. But when we're talking about the restroom, one of the adaptations we made because we had students who had autism that they couldn't just go in with the rest of the class because they had some of the things we saw in the video, especially with the privacy issues, where the social norm for the restroom is that people kind of stay in their stall and they come out when they're ready and everybody's fine. But these students didn't understand the social norms of privacy, so you couldn't really put them in there with the rest of the class. They also were able to meet their physical needs in the restroom, but needed someone to walk them through verbal prompts. So the policy we created for these people, these kids, was when they went into the bathroom, kind of without the rest of the kids, one leader would stand at the door with one foot in the door and would give verbal prompting to help them. So that was our policy. We can give verbal prompts. And so we would say, okay, now you're going to go into the restroom. Right now it's time to flush. Now we're going to get dressed. Now we're going to wash our hands. Now we're going to dry our hands and we're done. So that cost $0. But when we had that as our policy and we could train that for all of our volunteers, now no one is guessing what they should be doing. No one is upset, and the kids are able to be included.
You mentioned about neurodiversity and autism. Do you also have policies for mental health or other types of disabilities that are not physical, I should say?
I mean, my specialty has always been in the disability realm more than in mental health. So I'm probably not the right person to ask for that. Um, but as far as like, I don't know. That's a good question. I've not really thought of it that way because most of the people we serve, it's a little bit of both, physical and the emotional, social, communication differences.
Right. But those could also be definitely, because I know a lot of churches and synagogues have mental health committees
Hmm.
and inclusion. So
Hmm.
that can also be included in these policies, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can really, when it's coming to policies, write whatever you want. You're writing for the needs that you have and the needs you anticipate. And so, again, really the whole key to writing policies is asking those filter questions. Does it solve the problem? Is it sustainable? Does it impact other ministries? And then when it comes to disability, and I would say mental health, is it safe? Is it dignified? Is it sustainable?
Tom, I wanted to check if you had any questions.
No, I think Barb covered most of them, and yeah, this gives us a whole lot to think about,
Mm.
uh, especially as we're planning and want to make sure everything is going to be safe and for everyone involved. And I appreciate raising our awareness and giving us questions to ask ourselves when we're designing a program or implementing a disability ministry program. So uh, it does get complicated, but sometimes it can be simpler as well. So, um, but yeah, thank you, Barbara, uh, for presenting with us, and I think it gives us a lot to think about, and uh, it really does make us wonder and think through some different problems or different issues that we come up against uh, when we include and help people belong in our church. So appreciate that, and this is being recorded, so I will send everybody a copy of the recording, and then also people who have registered will receive that as well. So before we sign off, I'll just remind you that next Wednesday we'll have a roundtable on coping with the holiday stress. And so we'll learn from one another. We don't have a speaker, but we'll learn from one another different things that we can do to lessen that stress, not only for ourselves, but also for families that have kids or family members with disabilities. And that's a very stressful time for them as well because things are not always special needs friendly. And sometimes we get excluded from some of those activities. Um, so it'll be just a round table, and we'll address some different questions next Wednesday at 12 o'clock Central Time. So be looking for that link, and we'll be emailing and posting out the link for that roundtable. So until then, we want to thank you for attending, and thank you, Barbara, for your insights and your experience in working with disability ministries and helping those with disabilities belong in our churches and faith communities. Um, so thank you for that. And until next week, God bless you all for the work you're doing and your commitment to those with disabilities and our faith communities and churches. Thank you.
Thank you.